Princess Margaret's royal wedding was the ultimate deception. Antony Armstrong-Jones used his hidden bisexual life as a calculated weapon, betting powerful men for elite access and marrying a princess as his perfect cover. Margaret wasn't crushed by the weight of the crown. She was dismantled by a psychological predator operating directly from her own bedroom. The genesis of this deception was deeply rooted in the dreary, repressed atmosphere of London in the 1950s. The British class system at this time was an iron fortress. If you were not born into the aristocracy, the gates to true power were bolted shut. Trapped at the absolute pinnacle of this structure was Princess Margaret. Following the agonizing, highly public collapse of her forbidden romance with the divorced Peter Townsend, Margaret was adrift. By 1958, at 28 years old, the Queen's sister was viewed by the rigid establishment as dangerously close to becoming a spinster. She was fiercely proud, undeniably glamorous, but deeply wounded and intensely lonely. She was desperate for a connection that felt real, a life that possessed a pulse outside the suffocating protocols of Buckingham Palace. Into this void stepped Antony Armstrong-Jones. He was everything her world was not. Born into an upper-middle-class professional family, with a mother who largely abandoned him for higher society, Antony harbored a deep driving chip on his shoulder. He was an outsider who craved the inside. He established a small, dark photography studio in a basement on Pimlico Road, and this space quickly became his theater of operations. Antony realized early on that the camera granted him immense, unchallenged authority. The lens allowed him to direct people far above his social station, stripping away their defenses. But his most potent and devastating weapon was his fluid sexuality. In the coded underground world of upper-class London, Antony was visibly bohemian. He was actively and unapologetically bisexual, and he utilized this fluidity not merely as a preference, but as a strategic tool to bridge the immense gap between a commoner and the elite. His strategy was one of dual betting, a calculated method of using sex as a social ladder. He engaged in relationships with men who possessed influence, including designers like Nicky Haslam and interior decorators like Tom Parr. He understood that in this hidden subculture, intimacy was a currency that bought trust and access. But the most glaring example of his amoral approach to relationships was his deeply entangled dynamic with his closest friend, the wealthy chocolate heir Jeremy Fry, and Jeremy's wife Camilla. Antony was sleeping with Jeremy, and simultaneously he was sleeping with Camilla. This chaotic sexual triangle was not a messy mistake. It was a testament to his staggering charm and his total disregard for conventional boundaries. He embedded himself in their privileged lives, leveraging their wealth while maintaining a dual affair that would have obliterated most social circles. For Antony, human beings were instruments to be played. This ruthless methodology culminated in 1958 at a dinner party hosted by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish. Antony was invited as a token bohemian to inject life into the evening. He did precisely that. When he met Princess Margaret, he did not fawn or bow with the trembling reverence she was accustomed to. He treated her with a cheeky, irreverent familiarity. Crucially, because of his known associations within the gay subculture and his flamboyant mannerisms, Margaret initially assumed he was entirely homosexual. This assumption was his golden ticket. Believing he was safe, Margaret dropped her heavy royal guard. She felt she did not have to perform her exhausting royal duties around him. By the time he unveiled his intense heterosexual interest in her, the trap had already closed. He had successfully executed a bait and switch, offering the comforting illusion of a harmless confidant before revealing the thrilling, dangerous artist. The courtship that followed was clandestine and intoxicating. Margaret, the pride of the British Empire, found herself sneaking away to his dark Pimlico basement. He was the first man who made the haughty 28-year-old princess pursue him. She wrote him pleading, desperate love letters. Antony had completely inverted the power dynamic. He possessed her, and he understood exactly what that possession meant. By February 1959, he secured a commission to photograph her officially on the royal yacht Britannia, effectively moving his operation from the basement into the palace. However, the depth of his deception during this period is staggering. On May 6, 1960, they were married at Westminster Abbey in the first televised royal wedding in history. It was presented to the world as a triumph of modern love, a commoner rescuing a princess. Yet the reality was a grotesque betrayal. Just 3 weeks after the wedding, while Antony and Margaret were still essentially on their honeymoon, his close friend Camilla Fry gave birth to a daughter named Polly. While the world celebrated the royal union, Antony harbored a staggering, devastating secret regarding his true relationship with Camilla during the courtship. He had successfully orchestrated a royal wedding while actively maintaining a shadowy, deeply unethical double life. Even on their honeymoon aboard the royal yacht, Antony abandoned Margaret to take photographs, displaying a cold detachment the moment the trophy was secured. Once elevated to the peerage as the Earl of Snowdon in 1961, Antony obtained the Kensington Palace apartment, the titles, and the absolute deference of the British public. Having achieved his ultimate social ascension, the horrific realities of his narcissistic personality fully emerged. Antony abhorred the fact that his wife outranked him. Unable to attack her public status, he initiated a covert, systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to obliterate her private self. He avoided direct confrontation, preferring the cowardly precision of hidden notes. Over their 18-year marriage, he left dozens of hastily scrawled, vicious messages, hidden where Margaret was guaranteed to find them. In the book she was reading, tucked into her glove drawer, or placed squarely on her pillow. Beyond physical cruelty, he employed a sophisticated method of gaslighting intended to keep her in a constant state of anxiety and terror. One note, left simply on her desk, was a list titled 24 Reasons Why I Hate You. A weeping Margaret later confessed to a friend that she could not fathom 24 reasons to hate anyone. The most infamous and damaging note was discovered by the princess in her dressing room as she prepared for an evening engagement. Tucked inside her white glove was a piece of paper bearing Antony's handwriting. "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." This specific insult was a weaponized strike against her deepest insecurities. He used her height, her weight, and her fear of appearing vulgar to strip away her royal dignity, reducing her to what he called a cheap pantomime dame. Under this relentless psychological bombardment, Margaret's spirit shattered. She descended into severe depression, relying heavily on alcohol and sedatives to cope with the daily terror of her own home. As she withered, Antony thrived. He established a dark room inside Kensington Palace, a sanctuary where Margaret was strictly forbidden to enter. This room became a shrine to his narcissism, a place where he stored photographs of his numerous male and female lovers. He resumed his bohemian lifestyle with impunity, engaging in highly public affairs with women like Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs and Anne Hills, while openly mocking the royal family as middle class and suffocating. He demanded the privileges of an earl, but refused the responsibilities of a husband. When the marriage inevitably violently collapsed, culminating in their historic divorce in 1978, the true extent of the damage was laid bare. Margaret was entirely broken, isolated, and publicly vilified for her own desperate attempts to find affection elsewhere. She spent her remaining years battling the addictions forged in the fires of her toxic marriage, dying a shadow of her former self in 2002. Antony, however, retained his title, his palace apartment, and his celebrated career. He simply discarded the woman he had used to elevate himself, suffering absolutely no consequences for the devastation he orchestrated. The man who utilized his bisexuality and charm to infiltrate the highest echelons of power proved that a skilled narcissist can hunt down a royal, extract everything of value, and leave behind nothing but ruins. This devastating dynamic forces us to confront the reality of coercive control within the gilded cages of society. The tragedy of Margaret was not her lost loves of the past, but the predator she allowed into her future. And yet, the history of outsiders utilizing charm and calculated seduction to infiltrate and destabilize powerful institutions does not end here. The mechanisms of manipulation remain, waiting to be deployed by the next ambitious figure who views human connection not as a bond, but as a ladder. The transition from the honeymoon to the reality of married life at Kensington Palace was not a gradual cooling of passion, but a sudden, violent plunge into an emotional ice bath. Margaret, having rebelled against the stoic traditions of her family to secure this marriage, desperately wanted to prove her choice was a triumph. She envisioned a life infused with art, modernity, and a passionate partnership that would redefine her role and relevance within the monarchy. Antony, however, having successfully secured the ultimate royal trophy, found the actual reality of being a royal husband unbearably tedious. The glittering prize he had hunted so relentlessly suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating chain. He deeply despised the sycophancy, the endless rigid protocols, and most intensely, he despised the inescapable fact that he was required by birthright and tradition to walk 2 steps behind his wife. This fundamental resentment birthed a profound calculated cruelty. Antony did not simply withdraw his affection, he weaponized it. The expansive apartment at Kensington Palace, designated as their marital home, was quickly and aggressively partitioned both physically and psychologically. The absolute epicenter of his resistance was the darkroom he constructed within the palace walls. On the surface, he justified it as a practical necessity for his continuing career as a working photographer. In reality, it was an impregnable fortress of narcissism. He instituted a strict, unbreakable rule. Margaret was expressly forbidden to cross the threshold. While she was relegated to the sprawling drawing rooms, playing the increasingly hollow role of the dutiful princess, he vanished into the red-lit sanctuary of his own making. Inside that dark room, Antony curated a hidden life that directly mocked his marriage vows. He developed and hoarded intimate, often explicit photographs of his various lovers, both male and female. It was a visual archive of his ongoing betrayal, developed directly under his wife's roof. For Margaret, the dark room became a physical manifestation of her exclusion and his supreme control. He could emerge from the darkness whenever he pleased, often reeking of chemical developer and the scent of other people, only to retreat behind the locked door the exact moment she sought his attention, conversation, or emotional support. He effectively turned her own home into a site of psychological starvation, establishing an environment where his absence was as punishing as his presence. His flaunted infidelity functioned as a deliberate exercise in absolute power and calculated humiliation. In the vibrant, rapidly shifting cultural landscape of 1960s London, Lord Snowdon was elevated to a cultural icon. He roamed freely, riding his motorcycle through the city streets in leather jackets, immersing himself in a bohemian artistic crowd that viewed the traditional monarchy with open disdain. He flaunted his affairs with an almost pathological arrogance, confident that his position shielded him from consequence. The bisexual fluidity that had once fascinated and disarmed Margaret now became an instrument of her constant torment. He maintained close, intensely physical relationships with men within his circle, seamlessly transitioning between these underground encounters and highly visible affairs with high-profile women. The sheer scope and brazenness of his infidelity were dizzying. For a woman raised in the rigid, hyper-scrutinized environment of the Windsor family, where discretion was the absolute highest virtue and public scandal was the ultimate sin, Antony's flagrant behavior was a devastating shock to her nervous system. She was paralyzed by the visceral fear of public humiliation. She had already survived the global crushing scandal of her severed engagement to Peter Townsend, the prospect of exposing her husband's rampant bisexual affairs and admitting the total failure of her grand rebellious marriage was utterly unthinkable. Antony understood this paralysis perfectly. He knew she was permanently trapped by her own pride, her desperate need for the marriage to succeed, and her family's overarching reputation. This knowledge granted him total impunity. He could be absent for weeks on end for international photography assignments, returning only to treat Kensington Palace as a glorified, rent-free hotel and his wife as a bothersome concierge. The gaslighting, which had previously been executed through those devastating hidden handwritten notes, began to bleed poisonously into their verbal interactions and public appearances. Antony developed a habit of casually, conversationally degrading her in front of their closest friends. He weaponized her royal heritage, the very thing he had exploited to elevate himself, as a tool to make her feel inadequate. He would openly roll his eyes at her adherence to certain royal protocols, loudly dismissing her and the entire royal family as nothing more than a stuffy middle-class institution. He constantly mocked her intelligence, her aristocratic friends, and her cultural taste. When she attempted to discuss politics, literature, or art, he would systematically silence her with a patronizing smirk, treating her opinions as the naive, uneducated ramblings of a woman who only had a title because of an accident of birth. This calculated daily erosion of her self-esteem was relentless. He used his legitimate artistic credentials to establish a suffocating intellectual dominance, positioning himself to the world and to their social circle as the brilliant, misunderstood modern genius tethered to a conventional, demanding, and utterly exhausting princess. If she cried out of frustration, he simply ignored her. If she attempted to argue or demand respect, he turned his back and walked away, leaving her screaming into the terrifying void of the palace corridors. Lady Glenconnor and other close, horrified confidants watched helplessly as the vibrant, impossibly glamorous woman who had once captivated the entire globe began to physically and mentally unravel before their eyes. Margaret's highly publicized descent into severe substance abuse was not a fundamental character flaw, but a desperate, flailing attempt to self-medicate the unbearable pain of chronic, sophisticated emotional abuse. The evening gin and tonic, once a standard social lubricant, quickly became a necessary daily anesthetic to numb the reality of her existence. She began smoking relentlessly, the constant, suffocating haze of nicotine acting as a fragile shield against the icy reality of her marriage. She required powerful barbiturates to force herself to sleep, and potent amphetamines to wake up and face the day, becoming trapped in a vicious chemical cycle just to endure the daily humiliation of being married to a man who actively and visibly despised her. As her physical appearance inevitably began to reflect her massive internal agony, her face puffing, her eyes losing their spark, her posture slumping, Antony's outward disgust only deepened. He had deliberately broken the toy, and now he was genuinely repulsed by the shattered pieces. The immense, tragic irony of this era was the total complicity of the public and the British establishment. Antony Armstrong-Jones had manipulated not just a vulnerable princess, but the entire British press apparatus. He was incredibly skilled at public relations, carefully cultivating a flawless image of a dashing, hard-working, egalitarian photographer who had injected a desperately needed dose of modern cool and relevance into a dusty, dying monarchy. The media absolutely adored Lord Snowdon. When the inevitable rumors of vicious marital discord began to surface in the gossip columns, the narrative almost exclusively blamed Margaret. She was aggressively painted as the difficult, demanding, spoiled royal who was suffocating her brilliant, free-spirited husband with her archaic expectations. This massive societal gaslighting reinforced and validated Antony's private abuse. The entire world was telling Margaret that she was the core problem, echoing the very same lies he fed her in the darkness of their home. Driven to absolute screaming despair, completely isolated within her own emotionally stunted family, and publicly misunderstood by the nation she was supposed to represent, Margaret eventually sought validation, warmth, and affection elsewhere. Her subsequent highly publicized affairs, which the press documented with breathless, moralizing condemnation, were not the casual actions of a bored, promiscuous aristocrat. They were the frantic, drowning gasps of a victim of severe emotional neglect, desperately reaching for any semblance of human warmth to prove she was still alive. Yet Antony effortlessly used her infidelities as the final unassailable justification for his own cruelty, flawlessly playing the role of the aggrieved, long-suffering husband, all while his own locked dark room remained filled to the brim with the physical evidence of his infinite, ongoing betrayals. His mastery of optics allowed him to perfectly balance his double life. While Margaret was confined to the palace, nursing her hangovers and her shattered self-worth, Antony was out conquering the new classless society of the swinging 60s. He photographed the Beatles. He mingled with rock stars and actors, and he absorbed their cultural cachet, transferring it seamlessly to his own personal brand. He was the man of the hour, untouchable and universally celebrated. He had successfully decoupled his public identity from his royal marriage, ensuring that if the ship went down, Margaret would be the one chained to the anchor. He would simply swim away, his reputation not only intact but actively enhanced by the tragedy he had entirely engineered. The dawn of the 1970s brought no relief to Kensington Palace. It only sharpened the blades of Antony's psychological warfare. The cultural revolution outside the palace walls provided him with endless excuses to abandon his royal obligations and his crumbling wife. He embedded himself entirely in the world of celebrities, artists, and models, using his camera as a passport to a life utterly detached from the archaic protocols he claimed to despise. While he basked in the adulation of a society that worshipped youth and rebellion, Margaret was left to suffocate in the opulent, empty rooms of their marital home. Her isolation was not an accident. It was a carefully constructed prison designed by a man who thrived on her dependence and despair. Her daily existence became a grueling marathon of managing her husband's volatile moods and sudden crushing absences. Antony would frequently depart for international assignments without a word of warning, leaving Margaret to read about his glamorous exploits in the morning newspapers. The excruciating silence of Kensington Palace was broken only by the clinking of ice in her gin glass, a sound that became the steady metronome of her severe depression. She was a woman drowning in plain sight, surrounded by courtiers and servants who were institutionally incapable of throwing her a lifeline. The monarchy demanded stoicism, but Margaret was fundamentally unequipped to endure the sophisticated emotional violence inflicted upon her by a master manipulator. The whispers of their catastrophic union had long since seeped under the palace doors and into the offices of Fleet Street. However, the British press, captivated by Lord Snowdon's manufactured charm and egalitarian facade, consistently weaponized these rumors against the princess. She was mercilessly caricatured as a spoiled, demanding relic of a bygone era, a woman who was actively dragging down her brilliant, modern husband. Antony did absolutely nothing to correct this narrative. In fact, he fed off it, using the media's hostility toward his wife as the ultimate validation of his own cruelty. He manipulated public perception with the same cold, calculating precision he used to adjust the aperture of his camera lens. Pushed to the absolute brink of total psychological collapse, Margaret finally sought an escape route that did not involve alcohol or sedatives. In 1973, she was introduced to Colin Tennant's circle on the Caribbean island of Mustique, a private sanctuary that offered a temporary reprieve from her torment. It was within this sun-drenched, morally ambiguous bubble that she met a landscape gardener named Roddy Llewellyn. He was 17 years her junior, gentle, and utterly devoid of the venomous ambition that characterized her husband. For Margaret, this connection was not a calculated act of royal rebellion. It was a desperate, gasping attempt to find basic human warmth after more than a decade of freezing emotional starvation. Mustique was not merely a geographical location, it was a psychological fortress built entirely outside Antony's sphere of influence. Colin Tennant had purchased the island and deliberately transformed it into a playground where the rigid rules of the British establishment did not apply. For Margaret, stepping onto that white sand was the first time in over a decade that she could breathe without anticipating a sudden cutting remark from her husband. Here, she did not have to worry about finding a hateful note tucked into her beach towel or facing the terrifying silent judgment of the Kensington Palace darkroom. Mustique offered a dangerous, intoxicating illusion of total freedom, a temporary anesthesia for a woman whose daily reality was defined by relentless emotional subjugation. Roddy Llewellyn represented the absolute antithesis of Antony Armstrong-Jones. He was a mild-mannered landscape gardener, utterly devoid of grand designs on power or prestige, possessing none of the venomous ambition that characterized her husband. When he looked at Margaret, he did not see a stepping stone or a golden trophy to be conquered and subsequently destroyed. He simply saw a deeply unhappy, incredibly vulnerable older woman who desperately needed someone to hold her hand without an ulterior motive. This lack of agenda was precisely what made him so utterly magnetic to a princess who had spent her entire adult life being hunted by men who only wanted to extract value from her royal status. Antony seized upon his wife's infidelity with the predatory joy of a man who has finally been handed the perfect alibi. He had spent the entirety of their marriage maintaining a dizzying roster of secret lovers, both men and women, hiding behind the locked door of his Kensington Palace darkroom. Yet the moment Margaret stepped outside the marital boundary, he flawlessly adopted the role of the profoundly wounded, long-suffering husband. He used her affair to justify every ounce of his past and present cruelty, successfully convincing their social circle and the public that he was the victim of a chaotic, uncontrollable princess. His hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope, a masterclass in narcissistic projection and self-preservation. The crisis reached a fever pitch in 1976, when paparazzi photographs of Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn swimming together in Mustique were plastered across the front pages of British tabloids. The exposure was an unmitigated disaster for the royal family, triggering a massive constitutional headache for the Queen. Antony orchestrated his reaction with chilling brilliance. He immediately moved out of Kensington Palace, framing his departure as an act of dignified retreat from a hopelessly corrupted marriage. He left Margaret to face the absolute fury of the establishment, the press, and the public entirely alone. She was branded a parasite, a national embarrassment, and an unfit mother, while the architect of her destruction walked away with his reputation impeccably intact. The publication of the Mustique photographs shattered the carefully maintained illusion of royal propriety. Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who defined her entire existence by stoic duty and unwavering religious conviction, was forced to confront the messy, agonizing reality of her sister's broken life. The British public, struggling through intense economic turmoil and crippling strikes in the 1970s, possessed zero tolerance for a princess conducting an extramarital affair on a Caribbean island. The political pressure on the monarchy was immense, with members of Parliament openly debating the cost of Margaret's royal allowance. She was effectively sacrificed on the altar of public opinion to protect the broader institution. While Margaret absorbed the full devastating force of the public's wrath, Antony executed a flawless, highly calculated exit strategy. He utilized his extensive connections within the media to paint himself as the deeply sorrowful, exhausted husband who had simply reached the absolute limit of his endurance. He gave strategically placed off-the-record briefings to powerful journalists, ensuring that the narrative remained entirely focused on Margaret's instability and her inappropriate younger lover. He effectively erased his own extensive history of bisexual infidelity, his cruel psychological warfare, and his complete abandonment of his marital duties from the public court. It was a terrifying display of a narcissist controlling the narrative to ensure his own survival. The formal separation in 1976 was a brutal severing of a gangrenous limb, but the infection had already spread deep into Margaret's soul. She was formally stripped of the illusion of a successful modern romance, left to inhabit a shattered reality where she was entirely to blame for her own misery. The sheer injustice of the situation, that the man who had subjected her to 18 years of relentless gaslighting, infidelity, and cruel handwritten notes, was now viewed as the aggrieved party, deepened her reliance on chemical numbing. Her health began a rapid, terrifying decline, marked by severe bouts of hepatitis and the lingering destructive effects of heavy smoking and heavy drinking. The divorce was finally formalized in 1978, a historic and devastating milestone that officially ended the fairy tale the public had so desperately wanted to believe. It was the first divorce of a senior royal since the tumultuous reign of Henry VIII, and it sent shock waves through the very foundation of the British monarchy. Yet the true tragedy was not the institutional damage, but the complete and total annihilation of a human being. Antony Armstrong-Jones had utilized his marriage to extract titles, wealth, and unparalleled access, treating the Queen's sister as a disposable stepping stone. When she was completely hollowed out, he simply discarded the empty vessel and moved forward without looking back. Margaret was left to navigate the wreckage of her life in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the public eye. She had lost the war of perception completely. The establishment that had always viewed her as a volatile liability now saw her as a confirmed disaster. She retreated further into the walls of Kensington Palace, the very place that had served as her torture chamber, finding solace only in the company of a dwindling circle of loyal friends. The vibrant, intelligent, and fiercely passionate woman who had once captivated the globe had been systematically dismantled by a man who viewed human connection as a zero-sum game of power and domination. The staggering depth of Antony's deception was rooted in his terrifying ability to compartmentalize his existence. The foundational bedrock of their union was a meticulously constructed lie. He had stood at the altar in Westminster Abbey, exchanging holy vows with the Queen's sister, while successfully hiding the darkest, most devastating corners of his personal life from the establishment. His actions were driven by cold, sociopathic calculation. He navigated the most scrutinized family on earth while simultaneously managing illicit, conflicting realities in the shadows, executing his betrayals without exhibiting a single shred of guilt or remorse. Antony, conversely, suffered absolutely no professional or social consequences for the psychological violence he had perpetrated. He retained his earldom, continuing to demand the deference and perks associated with his royal title. He seamlessly transitioned into his second marriage to Lucy Lindsay Hogg, an affair he had cultivated long before his divorce from Margaret was final. The establishment, eager to move past the unseemly scandal, welcomed Lord Snowdon back into the fold with open arms. He continued to photograph the world's most famous faces, his legacy protected by a thick, impenetrable layer of aristocratic privilege and societal amnesia. The stark divergence in their post-divorce trajectories serves as a chilling testament to the power of coercive control and narcissistic manipulation. Antony proved that the most dangerous predators do not lurk in dark alleys. They wear tailored suits, possess devastating charm, and wield their sexuality as a weapon of mass emotional destruction. He infiltrated the highest fortress of British power, broke its most vulnerable occupant, and escaped with the crown jewels of high society. The royal family, with all its wealth and influence, was fundamentally powerless to stop a man who operated completely outside the bounds of human empathy and basic moral decency. We are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that society often protects the charmer while punishing the victim. Margaret's highly visible flaws, her drinking, her arrogance, her desperate affairs, were the direct measurable symptoms of her profound trauma. Yet, they were used to permanently disqualify her from public sympathy. Antony's crimes, executed in the silent darkness of his private quarters and the coded whispers of high society, left no physical bruises, allowing him to evade accountability entirely. He was the architect of a spectacular slow-motion assassination of a woman's spirit, a crime for which he would never stand trial or face true condemnation. The dark room in Kensington Palace stands as the ultimate chilling metaphor for Antony Armstrong-Jones's character. It was a space specifically designed to exclude the light, a place where reality could be manipulated, cropped, and altered to suit his precise vision. In that room, he was absolute master, controlling the image of everyone who stepped in front of his lens. But outside that room, in the messy, demanding reality of a human relationship, he was a destructive force of nature. He treated his wife not as a partner, but as a difficult, uncooperative subject who refused to pose correctly. When he could not control her entirely, he chose to destroy her systematically. To examine this era is to look directly into the abyss of a profoundly toxic relationship that played out on the world's biggest stage. It demands that we strip away the glamorous veneer of the 1960s and the glittering tiaras of the monarchy to reveal the raw, bleeding reality beneath. Margaret was not a tragic heroine who simply lost her way. She was the specific, targeted casualty of a man who consumed her light to illuminate his own path to power. The legacy of their union is not one of star-crossed lovers, but a permanent, haunting warning about the devastating consequences of marrying a mirror that only reflects your deepest flaws. The echoes of his gaslighting followed her for the remainder of her days. Even when surrounded by the few who truly loved her, the damage inflicted by those vicious hidden notes could never be fully erased. She remained permanently scarred by the belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, a cheap imitation of royalty unworthy of genuine affection. This was Antony Armstrong-Jones's most enduring masterpiece. He convinced a princess that she was worthless, ensuring that long after he vacated her life, the ghosts of his cruelty would continue to haunt the empty corridors of her mind. The decade that followed the unprecedented royal divorce did not offer Princess Margaret the liberation she had so desperately sought. Instead, the 1980s solidified her status as the monarchy's most convenient cautionary tale, while her former husband effortlessly glided into the next phase of his elite existence. The profound injustice of their post-marital realities is a chilling case study in how society fundamentally protects charismatic abusers while entirely discarding their damaged victims. Margaret retreated deeper into the cavernous, silent rooms of Kensington Palace, her physical and mental health rapidly deteriorating under the accumulated weight of 18 years of relentless psychological warfare. The poisonous echoes of Antony Armstrong-Jones's gaslighting did not vanish the moment the divorce papers were signed. They had permanently rewritten her internal monologue. She no longer needed him to slip a hateful note into her glove drawer to feel worthless. She had internalized his absolute disdain, carrying his cruelest assessments of her intelligence, her appearance, and her worth like a terminal diagnosis she could never outrun. Antony, entirely unburdened by guilt, remorse, or the massive institutional fallout he had intentionally caused, simply swapped one aristocratic backdrop for another. The ink on his royal divorce was barely dry before he married Lucy Lindsay Hogg, a woman he had been actively pursuing while still formally tethered to the Queen's sister. For a deeply entrenched narcissist, there is no period of reflection or mourning following the destruction of a relationship. There is only the immediate acquisition of a new, untainted source of admiration. He relocated, he redecorated, and he continued his incredibly lucrative career without missing a single beat. The staggering hypocrisy of the British establishment was laid bare in its continued enthusiastic embrace of Lord Snowdon. He was not exiled from high society. He was not shunned by the aristocratic circles that demanded strict moral compliance from their women. Most devastatingly of all, he was not even exiled by the Windsor family themselves. The ultimate unspoken betrayal of Princess Margaret came directly from her own bloodline. Her own mother, the fiercely beloved Queen Mother, cast a chillingly blind eye to her daughter's destruction, choosing the pristine optics of the monarchy over maternal protection. The royal family, prioritizing professional convenience and the avoidance of scandal over the emotional survival of their own flesh and blood, continued to employ Antony as an official photographer. He was regularly invited back into the royal fold to capture the family's most significant milestones. He took the official portraits of Diana, Princess of Wales. He photographed the Queen. He was literally hired to frame and define the visual legacy of the very institution he had so viciously mocked and exploited. For Margaret, the psychological torture of this arrangement is almost impossible to quantify. She was forced to watch the man who had systematically destroyed her self-esteem, who had mocked her royal blood and abandoned her for a string of secret lovers, be welcomed back through the front gates of Buckingham Palace as an honored guest and a respected professional. It was a clear institutional declaration that her immense suffering simply did not matter. This societal validation fueled Antony's belief in his own absolute invincibility, guaranteeing that his toxic behavioral patterns would simply repeat themselves with new targets. He did not leave Kensington Palace a changed man. He left it a more experienced predator. His second marriage to Lucy Lindsay Hogg was eventually hollowed out by the exact same rampant, unapologetic infidelity that had defined his time with Margaret. He maintained a secret, 2-decade-long affair with the journalist Anne Hills. When the immense agonizing pressure of being his hidden mistress finally became too much to bear, Anne Hills tragically took her own life on New Year's Eve in 1996. Antony's response to this devastating loss was chillingly stoic. He simply continued forward, untouched by the wreckage he left in his wake. Later, while still married to Lucy, he fathered another child, a son named Jasper, with a magazine editor named Melanie Cable Alexander. This final, undeniable proof of his chronic deception eventually forced Lucy to divorce him. But the broader societal narrative remained stubbornly focused on his artistic genius rather than his interpersonal collateral damage. While Antony continued to populate London with his mistresses and illegitimate children, maintaining his facade of the charming, eccentric artist, Margaret was fighting a losing battle against her own failing body. The decades of heavy smoking and severe alcohol abuse, the direct, measurable coping mechanisms she had developed to survive her marriage, began to exact a terrifying physical toll. Her legendary glamour, the sparkling vitality that had once made her the most photographed woman in the world, evaporated entirely. In 1999, she suffered a catastrophic accident in Mustique, the very island that had once served as her only refuge from Antony's cruelty. She stepped into a scalding hot bath, severely burning her feet and permanently destroying her mobility. The cruel irony was inescapable. The sanctuary where she had briefly found Roddy Llewellyn and a fleeting moment of peace had now become the site of her final physical undoing. Confined to a wheelchair, her vision failing, and her speech slurred by a series of devastating strokes, Margaret spent her final years as a living ghost within the royal apparatus. She was occasionally wheeled out for major public events, a frail, unrecognizable shadow hidden behind dark sunglasses, a stark visual reminder of the heavy, fatal price of royal duty and catastrophic personal choices. Her isolation was absolute. She had outlived her era, outlived her public sympathy, and outlived her own capacity for joy. The press that had once chronicled her every fashion choice now completely ignored her, viewing her as an embarrassing relic of a less disciplined age. She died on February 9th, 2002, at the age of 71. Her passing, occurring just weeks before the death of the deeply beloved Queen Mother, was treated by the nation as a somber footnote rather than a profound national tragedy. The woman who had been hunted, used, and discarded slipped away quietly, her life extinguished long before her heart actually stopped beating. The death of his royal victim did not prompt any public reckoning or private confession from Antony Armstrong-Jones. He continued to live exactly as he always had, shielded by his earldom and the protective amnesia of the British upper class. But science, unlike high society, cannot be charmed or gaslit. In 2004, 2 years after Margaret's miserable death, the foundational lie of Antony's royal ascent was finally dragged into the light. Polly Fry, the woman who had grown up believing she was the daughter of Antony's best friend, Jeremy Fry, had long suspected the truth about her parentage. She requested a DNA test. Antony, now an elderly man, finally submitted. The results were absolute and undeniable. He was Polly's biological father. This single piece of biological evidence completely rewrote the historical record of his marriage to Princess Margaret. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he had engaged in a sexual affair with his best friend's wife during the exact same period he was courting the Queen's sister. It proved that he had stood at the altar in Westminster Abbey, accepting the accolades of the world in the hand of a princess, knowing full well that his mistress was weeks away from delivering his illegitimate child. It exposed the absolute chilling sociopathy that governed his ambition. He was capable of monumental deception, orchestrating a royal wedding while managing a deeply unethical double life, without exhibiting a single symptom of anxiety, guilt, or moral conflict. When the DNA results were published, Antony offered no profound apologies, no grand explanations, and no expressions of regret for the decades of deceit. He simply absorbed the scandal with his trademark aristocratic detachment, refusing to grant the public or his victims the satisfaction of his repentance. Antony Armstrong-Jones died peacefully in his bed on January 13, 2017, at the age of 86. The obituaries published in the world's leading newspapers were overwhelmingly glowing. They celebrated his keen photographic eye, his egalitarian approach to portraiture, his advocacy for the disabled, and his undeniable status as a vibrant, disruptive force in modern British history. They mentioned his marriage to Princess Margaret as a glamorous, passionate, and ultimately mismatched collision of two fiery personalities. The narrative of the poor, trapped royal and the free-spirited artist was repeated one final time, permanently set into the historical record. The vicious hidden notes tucked into glove drawers, the rampant bisexual infidelities used to humiliate his wife, the locked dark room that served as a psychological torture chamber, and the total destruction of a woman's sanity were entirely scrubbed from the final assessment of his life. The most terrifying aspect of this history is not just that a narcissist succeeded in hunting down a royal trophy, but that the entire world watched him do it, applauded his technique, and then blamed the prey for getting caught in the trap. The marriage of Margaret and Snowdon is a masterclass in the mechanics of coercive control, demonstrating that the most effective abusers do not rely on physical violence to break their victims. They rely on the strategic withdrawal of affection, the weaponization of insecurities, and the flawless manipulation of public perception. Antony Armstrong-Jones proved that if you are handsome enough, talented enough, and ruthlessly charming enough, you can commit absolute emotional murder in broad daylight, and society will happily hand you the shovel to bury the body. This dynamic of power, deception, and the total lack of accountability for charismatic outsiders who infiltrate the Windsor fortress is a recurring nightmare within the modern monarchy. The blueprint Antony created using the royal family for supreme elevation while secretly despising everything they stand for was too successful not to be replicated. It established a dangerous precedent, proving that the royal establishment is fundamentally incapable of protecting its own members from sophisticated psychological predators who know exactly how to play the game. The illusion of the modern royal marriage, constructed so meticulously by the British press and consumed so eagerly by the global public in the early 1960s, was ultimately the most effective weapon in Antony Armstrong-Jones's arsenal. The catastrophe of this union requires a cold psychological autopsy of an environment that allowed a predator to thrive entirely unchecked, moving beyond the simple timeline of their affairs and divorces. We must examine the specific architecture of coercive control as it operates not in a domestic suburban setting, but within the hyper-visible, rigidly controlled confines of a royal palace. The tragedy here is not merely that a narcissistic individual inflicted immense pain upon a vulnerable woman, it is that the entire apparatus of the British establishment, the media, and society at large functioned as his unwitting accomplices, providing the camouflage he needed to systematically dismantle her sanity. Narcissistic abuse is fundamentally about the acquisition and maintenance of absolute power over another human being. For a man like Antony, born outside the aristocratic elite, but possessing a ferocious, driving ambition to conquer it, Princess Margaret was the ultimate, unprecedented target. She was not simply a beautiful woman. She was the living, breathing embodiment of an ancient institution that had historically excluded men of his exact background. By seducing her, he proved he could infiltrate the fortress. But the true narcissistic victory did not lie in the marriage itself. Merely standing beside the Queen's sister at royal engagements was insufficient for his ego, because it constantly reminded him that his status was entirely dependent on her birthright. To achieve true psychological dominance, he had to prove to himself that the woman who possessed this unearned supreme royal power was, in reality, pathetic, weak, and entirely beneath him. He had to break the princess to prove he was superior to the crown. This ruthless internal calculus explains the specific targeted nature of his cruelty. The relentless gaslighting executed through those devastating handwritten notes left in her glove drawers and books was not the chaotic lashing out of a frustrated artist. It was a precise, calculated methodology designed to distort her reality and erode her foundational sense of self. When he called her a cheap pantomime dame or a Jewish manicurist, he was deliberately attacking the only armor she possessed, her royal dignity. He understood that beneath the tiaras and the haughty public persona, Margaret harbored deep, crippling insecurities about her intellect, her physical appearance, and her ultimate purpose in a world where her older sister held all the actual constitutional power. Antony located the exact fault lines in her psyche and drove a wedge into them every single day. He isolated her emotionally, ensuring that her primary source of validation was a man who actively despised her. The environment of Kensington Palace amplified this psychological torture to a deafening volume. In an ordinary marriage, a victim of such severe emotional abuse might eventually confide in neighbors, seek professional psychiatric help, or physically escape to a different socio-economic reality. Princess Margaret was completely denied all these standard avenues of survival. She was trapped by the sheer weight of her title and the paralyzing fear of causing a constitutional scandal. The Windsor family ethos dictated that personal suffering must be entirely suppressed for the sake of public duty. When she attempted to signal her massive distress to courtiers or family members, she was met with a wall of institutional stoicism. They viewed her escalating depression, her heavy reliance on alcohol, and her erratic behavior not as the desperate symptoms of a woman being psychologically suffocated, but as the unfortunate, embarrassing moral failings of a spoiled princess. The institution demanded that she maintain the flawless facade of the fairy tale, effectively locking the doors of the cage while her husband dismantled her from the inside. This institutional blindness provided Antony with absolute terrifying impunity. He operated with the chilling confidence of a man who knows that his victim will never be believed. He manipulated the stark gender dynamics and the shifting cultural values of the era with masterful precision. In the rapidly evolving landscape of the 1960s and 1970s, society was eager to champion the rebellious, classless bohemian artist. Antony easily stepped into this celebrated archetype, utilizing his camera, his leather jackets, and his fluid bisexual lifestyle to construct an impenetrable aura of modern coolness. Whenever the reality of his vicious marital conduct threatened to leak into the public domain, he simply positioned himself as the brilliant, misunderstood creative genius who was being suffocated by the archaic, demanding rules of a rigid royal wife. The media enthusiastically swallowed this narrative whole. It was far easier and significantly more profitable to sell the story of a difficult, demanding, out-of-touch princess than to investigate the dark, complex reality of a highly charming, manipulative earl engaging in coercive control. The British public, deeply uncomfortable with the concept of male emotional abuse and completely unequipped to understand the nuances of gaslighting, eagerly participated in Margaret's public crucifixion. Every time a tabloid mocked her weight, her drinking, or her desperate search for affection and mystique, they were validating Antony's private insults. They became the ultimate flying monkeys in his narcissistic campaign, reinforcing his narrative that she was entirely worthless and deeply unlovable. He had successfully outsourced his abuse to the entire nation. The devastating long-term impact of this societal complicity is visible in the starkly divergent final chapters of their lives. When a victim of severe psychological abuse is entirely denied validation, when the world actively sides with their tormentor, the internal damage becomes permanent and irreversible. Princess Margaret's tragedy was that she ultimately believed the lies Antony fed her. She died entirely stripped of her confidence, convinced of her own fundamental failure, and heavily medicated against a pain that no doctor could formally diagnose because it was inflicted without leaving a single physical bruise. She was a casualty of a war that the world refused to acknowledge was even happening. Antony Armstrong-Jones's legacy, conversely, is a monument to the chilling effectiveness of sociopathic charm. He demonstrated that a total lack of empathy combined with devastating sexual appeal and a ruthless understanding of power dynamics is an almost unbeatable combination in high society. He did not simply survive the destruction of his marriage, he actively utilized the wreckage to build his own enduring legend. He continued to navigate the highest echelons of power, securing royal commissions, seducing a continuous stream of men and women, and accepting prestigious awards, all while leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. From the secret daughter he hid for decades, to the mistress who tragically ended her own life, to the princess he drove to the brink of madness, his entire existence was subsidized by the emotional and physical destruction of others. Yet history has largely chosen to remember him as a dashing, eccentric artist, burying the predator beneath the polished veneer of his aristocratic title. The story of the photographer and the princess is not a romantic tragedy. It is a crime scene that was deliberately swept clean by the establishment. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the most dangerous individuals in society are rarely the ones who break the law. They are the ones who understand exactly how to manipulate the rules, the ones who know how to weaponize intimacy, and the ones who can commit acts of profound emotional violence while maintaining an impeccable, charming smile. They use sex as a skeleton key to unlock doors that should remain firmly shut, and they view human vulnerability not as an opportunity for connection, but as an invitation for exploitation. This specific blueprint of infiltration, manipulation, and destruction did not die with Antony Armstrong-Jones. The inherent vulnerabilities of the royal institution, its desperate need for public relevance, its rigid isolation, and its historical inability to protect the mental health of its members, create an environment that is uniquely susceptible to this exact type of charismatic predation. The Windsor family remains a glittering, high-stakes target for ambitious outsiders who view marriage not as a sacrament, but as an acquisition strategy. And indeed, the shadows of the Kensington Palace darkroom stretch far beyond the reign of Lord Snowdon. While Margaret's story stands as the most glaring, undeniable example of a royal being hunted and dismantled by a bisexual, bohemian outsider, she was not the only member of the British upper class to fall victim to this highly specific brand of toxic, manipulative charm. The mechanisms of using fluid sexuality as a tool for social climbing, of gaslighting a powerful partner to secure dominance, and of leveraging media complicity to escape accountability form a devastating playbook. There is another history, running parallel to this one, involving another royal circle, another devastating scandal, and another charming predator who used the exact same weapons to catastrophic effect. The players change, but the devastating nature of the game remains chillingly identical. The silence that descended upon Kensington Palace following the formal dissolution of the marriage was not the peaceful quiet of a conflict resolved, but the heavy, stagnant stillness of a battlefield after the dead have been cleared away. The physical space that had once served as the glamorous epicenter of swinging London, the very apartment where Antony Armstrong-Jones had built his darkroom and systematically dismantled a princess, became a mausoleum for Margaret's remaining years. But the true collateral damage of this spectacular royal collapse was not confined to the architecture of the palace or the pages of the tabloid press. It was deeply embedded in the lives of the two people who were forced to grow up inside that psychological war zone, their children, David and Sarah. To fully grasp the insidious multi-generational reach of a narcissistic parent, we must examine how Antony manipulated the narrative, not just for the public, but within his own family unit. Growing up in the shadow of Lord Snowdon and Princess Margaret meant navigating a landscape of extreme emotional whiplash. Antony possessing the classic traits of a highly charismatic manipulator, understood perfectly how to play the role of the fun, bohemian father. He was the man with the motorcycles, the cameras, the fascinating celebrity friends, and the complete disregard for stifling royal protocol. He offered his children an intoxicating glimpse into a world of artistic freedom that seemed infinitely more appealing than the rigid duties of their royal heritage. Margaret, conversely, bore the physical and emotional scars of his abuse. As her depression deepened and her reliance on alcohol intensified, she inevitably became the heavier, more difficult parent. She was the enforcer of rules, the one anchored to the palace, the one whose moods were unpredictable and deeply colored by trauma. This dynamic is a textbook maneuver in the arsenal of an emotional predator. Antony effectively outsourced the grueling day-to-day emotional labor of parenting to the very woman he was simultaneously destroying, allowing him to swoop in and reap the rewards of being the exciting, beloved figure. He forced his children into an impossible psychological bind. To love their father meant aligning themselves with the man who was actively torturing their mother. Yet because his cruelty toward Margaret was largely executed in private, through hidden notes and silent dismissals, the children were often shielded from the raw mechanics of his abuse. They saw the charming artist. They did not always see the sociopathic husband. It was a staggering manipulation of loyalty, ensuring that even within her own family, Margaret was subtly isolated and outmaneuvered by a man who treated his own children as an extension of his public relations campaign. The historical record of this marriage has been subjected to a similar, highly deliberate manipulation. When we look back at the 1960s and 1970s, the visual evidence we have is overwhelmingly dictated by Antony himself. He was the photographer. He literally framed the era. He captured the iconic, beautiful images of Margaret, looking radiant and modern, creating a visual archive that completely contradicts the reality of her daily terror. We see the glamorous veneer, but we do not see the glove drawer where the hateful notes were hidden. We do not see the locked door of the darkroom. This creates a terrifying dissonance in how history judges the victim. Because Margaret's suffering was largely invisible, masked by designer gowns and royal stoicism, society demands that she provide proof of her pain. But how does a woman provide proof of a cold sneer, a deliberately ignored conversation, or a psychological environment designed to make her feel insane? The British establishment, including the royal biographers and the keepers of the archives, actively participated in this sanitization of history. To protect the dignity of the monarchy, there is a deep institutional instinct to minimize scandal and smooth over the ugly, jagged edges of royal dysfunction. After Margaret's death, many of her most private letters and personal documents were destroyed by her family, a common royal practice intended to protect her privacy. However, the ultimate tragic irony of this destruction is that it silenced her forever. By burning the evidence of her internal life, they inadvertently protected Antony. They erased her written anguish, leaving only his polished, celebrated photographs to tell the story of their union. The establishment essentially burned the crime scene to protect the reputation of the house, allowing the arsonist to walk away completely clean. It is only now, decades after the height of their destructive union, that modern psychology provides us with the precise vocabulary required to dissect what actually happened inside Kensington Palace. In the 1960s, the terms gaslighting, coercive control, and narcissistic personality disorder were not part of the mainstream cultural lexicon. Princess Margaret did not have the language to articulate the invisible prison she was living in. She only knew that she was suffocating, that her reality was constantly being denied by her husband, and that the entire world seemed to agree that she was the problem. She was fighting a ghost. Today we can look at Antony's behavior, the initial intense love bombing, the subsequent devaluation, the triangulating affairs with both men and women, the projection of his own flaws onto his victim, and the final brutal discard, and recognize it as a flawless execution of the narcissistic abuse cycle. He utilized a strategy of intermittent reinforcement, offering just enough charm and sudden affection to keep her desperately hoping for a return to the man she thought she had married, before plunging her back into icy disdain. This is the exact mechanism that creates a trauma bond, a psychological tether that makes it nearly impossible for a victim to simply walk away, even when they are being destroyed. Margaret was not weak for staying as long as she did. She was trapped in a highly sophisticated psychological snare designed by a master of human manipulation. Her drinking, her frantic affairs in Mustique, her erratic public behavior, these were not the causes of the marital breakdown. They were the desperate, thrashing symptoms of a woman trying to survive psychological strangulation. When we re-examine the later years of Antony Armstrong-Jones's life through this specific lens, the sheer audacity of his existence becomes almost nauseating. He lived well into his 80s, completely surrounded by a carefully curated echo chamber of sycophants, artists, and aristocrats who willingly bought into the myth of the great Lord Snowdon. He demanded absolute loyalty from his friends, his mistresses, and his staff while remaining fundamentally incapable of returning it. He viewed people entirely as disposable assets, discarding them the moment they ceased to be useful or entertaining. The suicide of his long-term mistress, Anne Hills, and the revelation of his secret children did not prompt a moment of public introspection or a decline in his social standing. The upper echelons of British society simply absorbed these horrific collateral damages as the acceptable cost of doing business with a genius. This societal complicity reveals a terrifying truth about power and privilege. The rules of basic human decency are entirely suspended for those who possess enough charm and enough cultural cachet. Antony was granted a lifetime pass for behavior that would have ruined a lesser man, simply because he was entertaining, because he took beautiful photographs, and because he had successfully weaponized the royal family's own aversion to scandal against them. He understood that the Queen would rather endure his continued hypocritical presence at royal events than drag the family through the mud of a public reckoning. He held the monarchy hostage with his absolute lack of shame. The ultimate failure in this tragedy does not belong to Margaret, but to the rigid, cold machinery of the Windsor family structure. Queen Elizabeth II, bound by a profound sense of duty and a lifelong commitment to preserving the institution of the crown above all personal considerations, was fundamentally unequipped to save her sister. The monarchy is designed to protect the monarch, not the collateral damage in the lower ranks. When Margaret was drowning, the institution did not offer a lifeboat. It offered a lecture on public duty. By prioritizing the outward appearance of stability over the internal reality of abuse, the royal family inadvertently functioned as Antony's most powerful enabler. They provided him with the stage, the lighting, and the captive audience he needed to perform his masterpiece of emotional destruction. We are left with a story that fundamentally challenges our desire for neat moral resolutions. In the real world, the villain does not always face justice, and the victim is not always vindicated in the end. Antony Armstrong-Jones died a celebrated earl, his chest covered in honors, his legacy secure in the national galleries. Princess Margaret died a broken, exhausted woman, remembered by the public primarily as a tragic, difficult footnote in the long reign of her sister. He won the game because he was willing to play without any rules, while she was crippled by the expectation that she had to play perfectly. The danger of this history is that it is incredibly easy to mistake his predatory charm for genuine character. The archetype of the dangerous, bohemian, bad boy remains a potent cultural fantasy, heavily romanticized in our literature and our media. But the reality of inviting that archetype into a position of absolute power, of tethering a vulnerable human life to a man who views empathy as a weakness, is always devastation. Antony's bisexuality, his artistic temperament, and his disregard for protocol were not the charming eccentricities of a free spirit. They were the precise, sharpened tools of a social climber who wanted to bleed the establishment dry. He proved that the most brutal conquerors do not arrive with armies. They arrive with a knowing smile, a camera, and a terrifying ability to make you believe that your destruction is entirely your own fault. The ultimate tragedy of the public's relationship with royal history is our desperate demand for a fairy tale, even when the evidence points directly to a crime scene. We consume the glamorous photographs, the televised weddings, and the designer wardrobes as a form of escapist entertainment. Antony Armstrong-Jones fundamentally understood this consumer apathy. He knew that if he provided the world with consistently beautiful modern images of the monarchy, the public would gladly grant him a permanent free pass to destroy a woman's life in private. When Princess Margaret died in 2002, her passing was treated as a grim inevitability. She was remembered primarily for her flaws, her severe addictions, and her arrogant public persona. The establishment framed her as a difficult woman who had simply burned out. When Antony died 15 years later, the narrative was entirely different. He was celebrated as a national treasure, a brilliant artistic force who had modernized the British establishment. This staggering disparity in their historical legacies is the absolute final victory of the narcissist. He controlled the ending completely. He ensured that the world remembered his talent while entirely forgetting his cruelty. To deconstruct this injustice, we have to look coldly at the specific mechanics of his social ascent. Antony did not achieve his position through traditional hard work or aristocratic inheritance. He achieved it by weaponizing his physical magnetism and his complete lack of moral boundaries. He viewed intimacy entirely as a transactional exchange, a currency to be spent on social climbing. His fluid sexuality was the ultimate skeleton key for unlocking the heavy doors of the British class system. He slept with the right men to gain access to exclusive drawing rooms and powerful benefactors. He then seamlessly transitioned to sleeping with the right women to secure his path to the royal altar. He compartmentalized his life with a terrifying sociopathic efficiency. By operating within the coded bohemian subculture of the 1950s, he avoided the traditional moral scrutiny applied to the upper classes. Margaret fell entirely for this carefully constructed illusion. She believed his outsider status made him safe, a refuge from the suffocating judgment of her own family. She did not realize that a man who respects no boundaries will eventually disrespect the boundaries of your own sanity. The cruelty he inflicted was not physical, which made it infinitely more dangerous. If Antony had ever struck Margaret across the face, the palace guards would have intervened. The queen would have been forced to take immediate, decisive action. But Antony was far too calculating to leave a physical bruise. He utilized invisible weapons. He used hidden notes tucked into glove drawers. He used deliberate, prolonged absence. He used public mockery masquerading as artistic eccentricity. He created an airtight psychological environment where Margaret was constantly on trial, and he was the only judge, jury, and executioner. She was completely isolated in a palace crowded with servants. The most devastating consequence of gaslighting is that the victim eventually internalizes the hatred of their abuser. When a person is told every single day that they are an ugly, worthless, cheap, pantomime dame, they will eventually look in the mirror and see exactly that. Margaret absorbed his disgust. Her subsequent severe substance abuse was not a character flaw. It was a direct, desperate medical symptom of a woman attempting to survive severe psychological strangulation. The British public cruelly punished her for these visible coping mechanisms. They relentlessly mocked her weight gain, her slurred speech, and her desperate affairs in Moustique. They never once paused to ask why the vibrant, confident princess of the 1950s had been reduced to a hollow, medicated shell. They preferred the easy, misogynistic narrative of a spoiled royal over the complex, ugly reality of a woman being systematically broken by her husband. The institution of the British monarchy proved entirely useless against a covert narcissist. The Windsor family is a machine designed to survive constitutional crises, wars, and political upheaval. They are fundamentally unequipped to handle a man who simply refuses to feel any shame. Antony recognized this institutional weakness immediately and exploited it without mercy. He knew the Queen would avoid a messy public scandal at almost any cost. He used the family's terror of negative press as a shield. He conducted his affairs openly, knowing the palace courtiers would scramble to cover them up to protect the broader institution. He essentially held the crown hostage with his own bad behavior. The greatest trick Antony ever pulled was making the royal family believe they needed his modern, artistic image more than they needed to protect Margaret's mental health. They sacrificed her survival for positive newspaper headlines. We must aggressively stop romanticizing toxic relationships as passionate or fiery. There was absolutely no passion in Antony's calculated cruelty. There was only cold, deliberate domination. He was a highly skilled predator who found the perfect, immobilized prey locked inside a golden cage. The story of Margaret and Snowdon serves as a definitive, terrifying warning about the nature of coercive control. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that immense wealth, global fame, and aristocratic titles offer zero protection against a psychological abuser. Emotional violence does not care about your social standing or your bank account. The damage it inflicts is absolute. This history also forces us to deeply examine our own societal biases. Why are we always so quick to forgive a charming, handsome man? Why are we so eager to tear down a complicated, suffering woman? Antony's spectacular success was heavily subsidized by a deeply unequal society that values male artistic genius far above female emotional survival. As we definitively close the book on this disastrous royal marriage, we must strip away the earl's title and the princess's tiara. We are left with the brutal reality of a man who used a human being for spare parts and a woman who was punished by the world for bleeding. It is a story of profound, entirely uncorrected injustice. But the dark mechanics of this royal infiltration were far too successful to remain an isolated incident. The specific blueprint Antony Armstrong-Jones created, using devastating charm, a camera lens, and a completely fluid approach to sex to bypass the rigid class system was highly effective. It became a terrifying playbook for ambition. There is another chapter in the long, dark history of charismatic outsiders hunting the Windsor family. There is another individual who utilized the exact same tactics to manipulate the highest levels of British society. This next figure also wielded a camera like a weapon. They also understood perfectly that capturing a flattering image was the absolute quickest way to gain the total trust of powerful people. And they also used their sexual magnetism to shatter the heavy boundaries of the aristocratic world, leaving a trail of ruined reputations in their wake. If you believe the psychological warfare inside the darkroom of Kensington Palace was terrifying, the next story reveals how these precise manipulative tactics can destabilize not just a single marriage, but the very succession of the crown itself. The game of royal seduction is always played with the highest possible stakes, and the victims are almost always the ones who falsely believe their titles made them untouchable. The story of Antony and Margaret ends not with a dramatic courtroom verdict, but with the quiet, suffocating triumph of a false narrative. We are left looking at a collection of beautiful, flawless photographs, forced to remember that the man behind the lens was systematically destroying the woman in front of it. The true horror of this royal saga is that the monster did not hide in the shadows. He stood directly in the flashbulb's glare, smiling confidently at a world that eagerly applauded his absolute cruelty. The hunt within the palace walls never truly ends. The predators simply wait for a new generation, wearing a different face, holding a different camera, ready to exact a terrible price for a perfect picture.